Solutions. And today I'm joined by Lizzy and Carly because we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of running a PR firm, especially as the industry is changing, and how all of us as the founders of our firm we really understand what it means to not just have fluff out there that we were put in a report and it sounds good, but it's actually going to be driving an impact for our client. So Lizzy, Carly, if you'll introduce yourselves.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dustin. I'm Lizzy. I'm the co-founder and the CEO of the Colab. We're a B2B and B2C tech PR firm.
Yeah, and I'm Carly Martinetti. I'm the co-founder of Notably. We're a boutique PR firm that specializes in high growth companies getting earned media coverage that converts to measurable business results.
Now the thing that you two of you brought up yesterday in our prep call that was really interesting was how, because we're all founders, we get it. And the two of you were the ones who suggested we put this into our agenda today. So can you help explain, Carly, what you just said about getting results? How does that compare to maybe agencies that don't get results but sound good and maybe make the industry look bad? How do you both differentiate yourselves in the tech space?
I mean, I think what you're probably referencing, Dustin, is that we had talked about just like the changing landscape of how LLMs are playing a role in PRs more specifically. And I think one of the biggest things is that, we had always said the goal with earned media was to make something go viral, was to, get brand mentions. There was also this component of like you only had a certain window to have something go, be a big blast in terms of a campaign. That's not the case anymore. Now it's, the media may forget, but the model remembers. And I think that's something that we should just be keeping in mind as agency owners moving forward is that, there's no ability to have lazy PR anymore. You can't just, throw something out and expect it to be good, bad, or indifferent. It has to really hit where you want it to in order to get the kind of brand recognition that lasts through the ages and translates into what an AI search is going to be looking at and wanting. So I think that's just a total sea change in terms of how PR is going to be functioning, how we're going to be looking at it. And, Lizzy has some great insights too, I know, in terms of like what that translates to from a campaign perspective.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that just like PR isn't a one size fits all approach, clients' goals aren't one size fits all either. So you can't really do the same thing for every single client. I think it's important to cater and tailor your strategy and approach to match that of your client and do so in a way that can evolve with their goals, right? Especially, Carly, you work with high growth businesses. A lot of the time, their goals are a moving target.
Mhm.
Your strategy needs to be able to pivot and be agile enough to move with that moving target as well.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And we actually see that we're a more generalist firm, but we see that a lot in public affairs where it's a national campaign and then suddenly three bills get introduced to the state level and we either have to support them or oppose them and find voices in that state. And so we're not no longer trying to get The Hill or Blaze Media or HuffPost, and now we're going for the local media outlet that no one even knows exists
Mhm.
outside of that region. But it's super important to reach the state rep or the state senator. And so, when it comes to just looking at my notes here, one of the things we talk about was that, you have talked a lot about this and on LinkedIn is getting earned media where it matters and not just in legacy media. I think Abby McAdams, posted her piece about should we even pitch TechCrunch anymore?
Mhm.
Lizzy, you've definitely talked about how it's not just Wall Street Journal. And Carly, I was shocked to see you cite Wall Street Journal the other day because you've just last week you were pointing out that some things you're saying. I think you've said no to the Wall Street Journal at times because they're not necessarily the prime target. So let's talk a little bit how that landscape changed. I mean, this is pre-LLM, this is pre-AI, this is just the advent of the internet and how that changed PR for good and ill. So, Lizzy, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the TechCrunch thing, that's such an interesting case study, right? Like they obviously were trying to monetize in a way that would evolve with the changing media landscape, and I think they did so in a really reckless way. The statement that they put out last week completely missed the mark on their layoffs. And I had, a couple conversations this morning about funding announcements and whether or not to even pitch them. An exclusive to TechCrunch was completely off the table. So thinking about, you said the way that it's evolving, it's not just the publications that have evolved themselves, it's also the publications that, which Carly alluded to earlier, that the LLMs prioritize, right? More and more business executives every single day are going to ChatGPT, are going to Claude and asking them, who's the number one cybersecurity service provider in the US? And if you're not popping up in those search results, they're probably not going to talk to you. People want to do as little work as possible to reach the answer that they're looking to reach. So it's important to understand this is a multifaceted approach, right? Like it's two-pronged. One, how you show up in the places that those LLMs are scrolling, whether it be publications, we talked about the Wall Street Journal, we talked about the New York Times, TechCrunch. There's also, American Banker when you start getting into the vertical
Right.
things.
Right.
Also, G2 Crowd, Reddit, review sites, awards are now taking place as far as what, right. And that's tricky, right? Because
Right.
a little hit or miss. Understanding which sites those LLMs scroll to produce their results. The second prong to it is all these businesses can and certainly should be producing their own content. A lot of, obviously, like most companies have a blog. They should also have a presence on LinkedIn. Their executives should have a presence on LinkedIn. Everywhere they're producing content, there's a way to do it in a specific way that's easier for the LLMs to read. And it's going to prioritize that content too. So it's not just showing up, it's in the way that you produce your content too. And so, thinking about legacy media, thinking about new media, all of those things play a role in sort of the quality of coverage, where you're showing up. It's no longer this broad swath, 100 places, because they don't matter, right? One, there's fewer publications than there's ever been. And two, fewer publications are being indexed by the places that matter now. So it's really more of an intentional quality over quantity approach, more than it's ever been.
I would just want to tack on to that I think everything you said was spot on. And I also envision, how with SEO, like domain authority was the number one indicator in terms of where you were going to be looking for placements. I think there's going to be a new tier system in place where now we're looking at LLM weight, basically, of, which outlets are going to be more valuable than others, just as you were saying, like depending on how they're being scraped, if they're, being shown in answers and results and stuff, that's really going to matter in terms of being able to say, okay, to clients, we should go with this outlet versus another one for a specific type of announcement. So I think that's going to be something that changes as well.
Yeah, GEO, right? It's basically the generative function of SEO, how you're showing up in those LLMs. And SEO companies who are smart will jump on it. It's going to be the biggest thing. Something that's so interesting, we talked about the WSJ earlier. Right now, most of the LLMs don't crawl content that's behind a paywall.
Well, you mentioned this yesterday. That's right.
When you're talking about those legacy publications, that's a really big issue that these publications are going to have to adapt to, because if their content is no longer scrolled by the number one place that business executives are looking for answers, that's a miss, right? And so they're going to have to update their licensing agreements, their content agreements with these LLMs in order to remain relevant, because people aren't going to pay $1,500 for a subscription to a publication that only comes to your inbox once a day if it's not showing up other places.
Well, and the irony about that, again, we're not in the tech space. We had an AI client a couple of years ago, right as ChatGPT came out, and when Wall Street Journal's parent company threatened to sue the ChatGPT OpenAI for allegedly stealing their content, our client said, actually, we spend more money paying, the AI company said they spend more money paying for access to 8,000 news outlets and other sources than they do on their cloud software, because they felt it was important to have, if you want high quality content, you've got to be able to pay for it. Otherwise, the quality goes down, because it's human content that this stuff is scraping. But as we move forward into that kind of technology, and as you're thinking through the strategy, Lizzy, you said that there's fewer outlets than ever. I'm going to disagree with that because of blogs, because of, there's a lot of republishing. Sometimes if I look for a New York Times article or a Washington Post, I can find it republished at MSN or Yahoo or AOL. So I do think that there are a lot of those small outlets. We know Tracy Schmidt talks about the micro influencer has fewer than 10,000 followers, but they're super important. So when you say outlet, what is your definition of outlet for this context of this conversation?
Yeah. I mean, to be totally transparent, I don't think my opinion matters. What I think matters is the opinion of your client, right? So
Fair.
it's difficult. It's difficult because you look at these legacy publications and you look at, like Yahoo and Wall Street Journal and New York Times and TechCrunch, and you're looking at millions and millions of
Right.
UVMs. Then you're looking at, journalists who have broken off from Bloomberg, from
Right.
Fortune, started their own Substack,
Hmm.
30 or 40K subs. When it comes to it, that doesn't really matter. What matters is your target buyer in that sub, and how are you getting in front of them? The good thing about Substacks and newsletters is that you're getting in front of your target audience where they already are, right?
Hmm.
They're already in their inbox.
Right.
So being able to get sort of that front and center visibility, it's pretty unmatched. A couple years ago, when you would get a piece on the homepage of TechCrunch, it would be there for what, 8 minutes before it
Yeah.
was drawn up by any new pieces because editorial minimums were so high. So it's really
Right.
about being where your audience is, where they're already consuming information and looking for sources, but also maximizing the impact of that hit. That's something that we talk about a lot. So, okay, let's say you get this really great hit in a publication, then what? Right? If you don't do anything
Right.
with it, if you just let it live there, you don't put it in your sales deck, you don't put it on LinkedIn, you don't turn it into a byline, you don't put it into your newsletter, you don't send it to your
Right.
investors. If you don't multiply that, that's really your loss, right? Like I think getting the hit is honestly step one of 100. That's when the real work begins. That's when you really have to
Right.
maximize the lifespan of that hit. And I think, that also gives you another opportunity to get in front of your target audience in a more intentional and meaningful way that wasn't really leveraged a few years ago.
hmm Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I also feel like, there's going to be a resurgence in some of the, I guess, mediums, because you had mentioned blogs, Dustin, and like some other things that used to be also like very big in the past. I think honestly, there's going to be press releases are going to be a thing again, not for actual humans reading them, but I think that they're going to be important for, again, like feeding that AI
Right.
algorithm just to have
Yep.
a historical chronological timeline of events. And so I do
Hmm.
think there's going to be not only the change in terms of where you're pitching from, as Lizzy was saying, like an audience standpoint, and captive audience always will reign supreme, I think, over these glamorous figures of Yahoo looking at, several million a minute. But, having that really honed in matrix approach of, thought leadership, also another thing that I think is going to have even more weight, contributed articles at placement at tier one publications, so like a Fast Company byline for your executive. While that was always great to have, now it's going to bump them even further in terms of their credibility with an AI. So it's looking at it through like that lens, not just from a channel standpoint, not just from an audience standpoint, but also from a authority standpoint, such that you can maximize all three to be able to get the types of coverage that clients, need.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit. I think you're right about having the press release as sort of this moment in time. It is scrolled by the LLMs. It is important to have that, like you said, this chronological history. Something that we're really starting to see, though, is this owned content, sort of founder forward comms.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So, like when a
Yep.
company has an announcement, they'll put out the press release. Founders are now wising up about the value of a press release. And what they're really starting to find is that they can actually get quite a bit bigger impact by leveraging their owned audience, let's say on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Right.
I can't recall the company, but a couple weeks ago, I saw a founder announce a funding announcement. And it was a smaller round, right? It was a seed, and that's really difficult to get in traditional media, especially these days. So he announced it on his LinkedIn to his followers in his own words, in his own voice, and it went viral, right? And the reason that it went viral was that LinkedIn News picked it up, and instead of linking to the press release, they linked to his LinkedIn post, right? And so we're just starting to see sort of the powers that be direct traffic in a way that they haven't before. And so it's really not just about the press release is an asset, right?
Right.
It's what you do, and news is an asset, like your story is an asset. It's really what you do with it, and and how many times you do that, right? Like if you're just putting out a press release, you're missing a huge opportunity for that announcement. You need to be putting it on all your different platforms in all these different ways to connect with your audience on, where they are. It is just really interesting to see how it's evolving.
Well, and to that point, I mean, you mentioned Carly, back when blogging was actually like you could have a job there. That
Yeah.
was my first full-time media job, was a blogger. I was putting out 25 pieces a week, and
Mhm.
some of them were like really short, intro, copy paste, transition, took me 15 minutes to put it together.
Yeah.
But blogs reigned supreme for probably a dozen years or so. And they were just a great way for, I was a mid-20s guy and didn't really know anything, but I was willing to write things at 10 p.m. and send them around and got myself out there. And at least in in the political space, and I found this when I was running comms for a trade association, getting into those really niche blogs. I ran into communications for the pet industries trade association.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was great to get the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, but it was the literally the fish bloggers and the reptile bloggers where we made the biggest difference because like these aren't the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles; these are real like lizard people. And
Yes.
so like we went to Hawaii on an issue, and the fish bloggers were like chomping at the bit to get into the legacy media down there because that's what the lawmakers were reading, and they didn't know how to do it. So by
Mhm.
having those relationships, yes, we got the blog hits, but we also got that gave them the credibility to get into that legacy media and make that impact. Same thing with the reptile folks. And so, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me that if PR Newswire becomes more valuable again, it wouldn't surprise me if these Substacks and blogs become super super valuable because that person is going, that former CNN reporter or whoever becomes that go-to source, and then their buddies at Legacy Media pick it up and run with
Right.
it,
Right.
or vice versa. You can be on that front end at Legacy Media, and then all those blogs pick it up, and your name gets streamed all the way down too.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a lot more interconnected than it's ever been, right? Like I do think that these legacy pubs will start to pick up on like Substacks will be the ones breaking the news. I do think that'll happen. I think people are starting to shy away from legacy media, and I don't necessarily recommend that. I think a really
Sure.
comprehensive media strategy incorporates and encompasses all levels of media, whether that's
Right.
Substacks, blogs, podcasts, bylines, editorial interviews, all of it. Like I do
Right.
think it's all really important, and I don't think you should put all your eggs in one basket. But I do foresee, especially because of layoffs, right? Like these publications are still required to
Yes.
put out this content, and how are they going to do that without syndicating?
Mhm. Right.
I would also add that I think that there's a mega opening for brands to create their own newsrooms. I've been seeing this a lot, and not just, content that supports the brands, but actual news, like actual reporting done. So, how Robinhood, for example, has Sherwin News, right? Like they have hired reporters that have left other financial publications to come and work for them and basically run that publication somewhat independently, right? And so I think there's going to be a lot more of that where these kind of stand-up newsrooms start happening for brands. And I think PR people should be part of that as well, just to be able to shape the narrative of not only what is the brand talking about from a news perspective, but how can they influence the news that way too. So there's a lot of really good examples out there right now of this happening. And I think that's just another channel that isn't really, I think, saturated enough like it should be.
Yeah,
So now let's talk a little bit about credibility of some of these digital locations. We talked yesterday about you know TechCrunch. Again, I actually, Lizzy, if you wouldn't mind, I meant to look it up between yesterday's meeting and this conversation, but what happened? You both talked about this yesterday that TechCrunch made this big mistake. Can you explain it for the dummies like me who don't know what's going on?
total train wreck. So TechCrunch laid off their entire EU staff. They quietly shut their EU doors. There's no boots on the ground there anymore. There was no statement about it. Basically, all of the reporters were coming on LinkedIn and saying, like, I'm very surprised. I'm like deeply saddened to announce that there's no
Oh,
an EU presence for TechCrunch. And then their chairman, I think he was, came
Michael.
out.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Michael, a couple days ago. Was it Thursday? I don't, it was such, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday of last week. Basically issued a statement that said, like, we're doubling down. You can be sure that we'll be at these events. And like, it was a really kind of like
oof.
rah-rah pep rally
Right.
type of statement. And
Mhm.
it came off, it didn't come off as encouraging or empowering. It came off as highly defensive and combative.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yep.
and he didn't address the layoffs.
Of
And
course you
it
didn't.
was really it was tactless, and it was really misguided, right? For somebody who has access to, arguably some of the best journalists in tech, he clearly
Mhm.
didn't run it by a single one of them.
Right.
It missed the mark in pretty much every way, because even though he was trying to say, like, yes, we still have a presence in the EU, he didn't at all clarify what that meant, right?
Right.
He will be at these industry events, and it's like, yeah, well, like, so will Joe from Ohio, but he's not in the EU.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, and so it really, that's what happened. And now everyone, if they weren't worried about TechCrunch's credibility before, they're deeply worried about TechCrunch's credibility,
Right.
because if they're putting out
Right.
statements like this, which clearly have no pulse on the audience that TechCrunch targets, on the journalists
In
that
any way, shape, or form. The
remain,
founders, their audience, the
what,
PR.
yeah, like,
Right.
what else are they gonna do? Uh,
Mhm.
TechCrunch is such an interesting use case in this, because unlike most companies that conduct layoffs or, riffs or whatever it is, we know the staff, right? Like, the
Right.
tech staff is almost like our team. We've worked with these people. They feel like colleagues,
Yeah.
right? So we have an emotional investment to the people that work there. And so for him to do that felt like he not only slighted the people that he laid off, he slighted the people that still work there, and he slighted every single person that works with the TechCrunch staff and who wants to be in TechCrunch. I truly don't know how he could have navigated it worse.
I will also add that before this portion of things came to light, like, I don't know about you, Lizzy, but I had had some questionable experiences with how things were being handled on the editorial side for people that, like, I had worked with in the past. And so it had gotten to a point where I was actually scared to say that TechCrunch accepted an exclusive, because I didn't know if they were actually going to keep their word on something like that. And that erosion of trust from their side to ours was also shocking to see, because I had worked with them, for years, and it's been the go-to for all of these huge announcements and, wonderful people that I've worked with. But it's yeah, it was just shocking, because some things happened that were like, really? And so we had to go back to clients and explain, hey, this isn't like them. I'm not sure what's really going
Mhm.
on. And then as the months went on, things started coming out, in the news. So it explained a lot of what we were experiencing. But to me, like, that, if it would happen to me, it happened to a lot of people. And so that just basic lack of transparency in terms of how things were being handled and should have been handled appropriately knocked them so far down in my list. And I hate that because I love them.
Well,
Like, I really, really, truly loved their reporting. The people, as you were saying, Marianne, Christine Hall, everyone was phenomenal. And so just to have that not only like cut them off at the knees from being able to do their work, but then also hinder PR's stories from getting out there, from brands getting their messages out there, in a cohesive way. It's just really upsetting, the whole thing.
I think a
yeah.
lot of that came from those reporters not knowing if they were going to have a job in 2 weeks.
Yeah, basically.
Like, it speaks volumes about the publication, and I think what was going on behind closed doors, and I think very little about the reporters themselves, right? Like, we know that the
Oh,
quality
100%. Yeah.
that reporting is truly unmatched when it comes to tech. But yeah, I think it does go to show that there was just so much uncertainty and so much movement going on for so long. And now it's come to light, right? Like, the people that are calling the shots don't understand this landscape and what it means to tech companies all over the world.
Mhm. Yeah.
The what's interesting to me is that the two of you are willing to say this about TechCrunch. A
Totally.
year a year ago, would you have said any of these things? Like, would you have been concerned about risking the reputation of your clients a year ago?
I mean,
But if you were criticizing a TechCrunch or a similar outlet?
I mean, if it was happening the way that it was for that long, I would have no problem saying it out loud, honestly, because It was just some of the things that went down like were egregious in terms of
Oh,
like
okay.
the
All right.
level of acceptance, interviews, priorities that were told. And of course, things happen in, news all the time, but there was a big, disconnect between how things normally function and the way that
Mhm.
they did. And so I think if that had gone on longer than the time period, and again, I'm talking about like a month, 2 months, right, where there was something amiss, then I would have felt comfortable definitely saying like,
But
hey, what's going on over there? Like
well,
something's
and
not
I guess
right.
I misspoke. I just mean more like the two of you and a couple of other people I've seen post about this kind of stuff on LinkedIn. It's to me, as the outsider, it's indicative of not just mistakes happen or maybe they had some bad management temporarily, but it's indicative where TechCrunch is as an outlet in the market now compared to where it was a year or two ago. And that's more what I was talking about is if you have clients that you're pitching, an editor probably knows who the two of you are and the people at your company,
Mhm.
maybe even a senior editor, right? Or a person in management. And you're not afraid of your clients getting cut off of the needs of TechCrunch anymore.
No,
Right?
because a reporter with journalistic values would
Integrity, right?
would never take that into consideration. And I will say, I have been saying this. I posted like for 6 to 12 months, I've been saying this. Like one of my posts, I think opened up with like TechCrunch, are you okay?
Mhm.
Because because
Oh, it
it's
did. I remember this one from like three
yeah,
months
it seemed
ago.
to be falling
Yep.
apart at the seams. And quite frankly, our clients hire us to be experts. They don't hire us. They want to know who our connections are, right? And that question is a little misguided in and of itself, which is fine. But
Right.
ultimately, they want to know who our connections are in journalism, and our connections are to TechCrunch. They don't want to know no no reporter is going to write a story on you just because you're their buddy, right? And they're,
Right.
and
Of course.
the opposite of that holds true as well. This is something we've been talking about for years. I also think reporters feel the empathy in that, right? Because what we're seeing from an outsider's perspective, they're living,
Mhm.
right? We're talking about day in and day out, internal politics, their boss, their wage, right? Like what they're making and bringing home to their family. It's like they're living this turmoil. And
Right.
to see that others see it from an outsider's perspective, I'm not at all trying to disrespect this publication. I still, what TechCrunch has created over the years has been unmatched. It is yet to be seen what it's going to turn into, but ultimately, like, call a spade a spade. You know what I mean? Like they messed up and
Right.
they messed up in a lot of different ways over and over and over again. And it
Sure.
impacted dozens of highly skilled reporters, some of the best
Right.
in the world when it comes to tech. And like, it's not my job to make something seem as if it's not. It's my job to be an expert within the media relations space. And some of that comes with calling out the good and the bad.
So maybe that's just my background in politics, where if you
Yeah.
pick up enough people, they're can often be more petty, perhaps.
Yeah.
So maybe that's my bias there. That's no, that's a really good point. I mean, one of the things that we keep talking about with, we talked a little bit about Reddit yesterday and with some of the scraping that's going to be going on is as some of these, sort of top tier, for lack of a better term, the legacy media outlets are laying people off, are being bought by PE firms and changing their models. You were one of you, I forget which one, was expressing some concern about how Reddit is going to become more prominent over time and is being scraped and considered a really valuable source. How is that different than what we see in social media, where an influencer posts something and suddenly we think, people think it's credible because they trust that person? How is that much different than what we're going to be seeing with Reddit and scraping?
Yeah. I think I understand what you're asking. Like
Yeah.
you're asking kind of, okay, so right now the LLMs do scroll Reddit.
Right.
It's primary sources for every single LLM, at least the primary ones that you use.
Sure.
You're saying how is that different than sort of like posting your content on LinkedIn?
Well, in terms of like someone who's famous can post something and everyone thinks it's credible, right? I see people post in politics all the time things that are flat out wrong.
Yeah.
Not just I disagree with them, they're just factually incorrect.
Yeah.
And yet, as everyone I hear from the PR in the PR world who looks at Reddit, it's come up on my program a few times, is that Reddit is seen as credible in a lot of circles. And sometimes it really is, some of these very specialized threads. And
Well,
I wouldn't
You
go
were
that
both
far.
you, but you both took an opposite perspective that like journalists are actually going into Reddit and saying what is being discussed? How can we use this as inspiration for what we're talking about and for stories and trends and other things?
Okay, I see the inherent issue here. So journalists look to Reddit to get like consumer pulse points, right? And understand that.
Mhm.
And they know the type of content that they're sourcing. They're not sourcing it as fact. They would never position it as fact.
I
The
see.
LLMs surface information and people take it as fact. Try working with an LLM, have a query, ask it, then ask it to get deeper in it, ask it to get deeper in it. 3 or 4 levels into that funnel, you're going to frustrate that LLM and it will not deliver what you're looking to have delivered. It simply is not there yet. It cannot handle extremely complex problems, especially when you dig into it. So LLMs are presenting information from G2 because they source information from G2. It's not presenting it as fact, you're taking it as fact. If you ask it to justify its logic, it will come back and say, you're absolutely right. That's incorrect. I don't know why I said that. Here's something that's a little more true. But I think the issue isn't that people are just taking it as fact.
I see.
That's a choice. When you're working with the LLMs, especially right now, you need to understand that there's an inherent bias there and you need to be able to check that work. It's not presenting you 100% factual information. It wants to please you and it's going to say anything that it can to make your argument stronger, whether or not that's factually correct.
And
And
I
I
think
think, Dustin, it's also just like the bias puck has passed. You were saying basically like, you see all the time people tweeting or putting out things
sure.
that politicians and it's taken as fact. It's the same thing. They have an inherent bias towards what they're saying, and their
Right.
readership is having, an inherent bias in how they're synthesizing that, right? But at the end of the day, it's just knowing inherently that there is a bias that you have to put a filter through, and that's the same thing here.
Yeah, you
But
need
I
to.
see now, Lizzie, why you were confused because basically the social media equivalent would be using social media to see what's trending and get the pulse of what's going on versus using someone's tweet as a source.
Mhm.
I think that would be
Which a reporter would not do, but an
which a
LLM
reporter would not do.
would
Right.
do.
I see why you were confused
Yeah,
by
and
when
so
I
like
first
you,
presented that.
LLMs have not eliminated the inherent need for human discernment, right?
Right.
You still, as a person who's seeking information and producing information, need to have a very healthy level of discernment when working with the LLMs. I'm not
Yep.
sure if it will ever get to the point where we can simply treat it as fact, but humans are
Right.
also more likely to seek an answer that, that agrees with their bias than is
Right.
factually correct. Like that's just what we've seen in the last 15 years. That hasn't changed. We just have a new tool that now can tell us what we want to hear. The thing
Sure.
that's that businesses and some executives are treating it as fact. That will all change, right? Like people are starting to
Right.
understand the quality of information that is presented by the LLMs, what they can and can't do with it. There's going to be licensing agreements in place. All of these things will evolve.
Right. That makes sense.
I do think that's going to open up a whole new playbook for the crisis comms division, though. I mean, seriously, like that's going to be a
That's a good point.
really, really
Mhm.
big deal for them. Just be able to say, okay, we're going to have to do crisis training now with AI generated queries that are serving false information about us, or how do you
Right.
combat like all of that disinformation? The hallucinations, everything that happens. That's going to be a whole other can of worms to get through.
Interesting.
I think that one of the solutions to that is to get, back to what we all do every day is get your narrative out there. And
Mhm.
we call it surround sound marketing and branding, where whatever number of tools you have available, use them all. Because if someone lies, last week we were talking about this. It was, I think it was Ryan who talked about it. That if you lay out your brand for years before the crisis arrives, whether it's political or otherwise, people will give you some credibility because you've hooked them emotionally. They've seen your brand. McDonald's did a great job on the E. coli and Trump potential crises they had last summer. But even if they had botched it to a degree, there would have been that inherent trust of 50 years of them being in the public eye and being at every rest stop, etc. And so I do think that, PR will become more important to get in front of, especially the thought leadership component, but getting in
Yeah.
front of all of these potential crises, because someone's going to lie about you eventually. Someone's going to sue you, no different than a bad Yelp review or someone suing somebody claiming you gypped them or you were the reason they got injured. It's not different. It's just more expansive opportunities and more numerous opportunities.
Yeah.
So how do we as PR professionals, one of the things we talked about yesterday was translating from PR to C-suite. How do we help clients recognize that what we do is valuable when they say, oh, I can just get AI to do it. Or, we can just put it on social media and let it carry forward. When in reality, what we're trying to do is build that reputation in a very proactive way.
It always reminds me of people who say, well, not, they shouldn't be saying this, but I've heard it said that, if they're going to hire someone to represent themselves in court, when you get a lawyer, instead of
Right.
just representing yourself, right? Like it's the
Mhm.
same thing here. You want to have an expert, you want to have someone who understands the ins and outs of everything to be doing the work for you, not relying on essentially, something that hasn't been proven to be able to do this stuff for you. And as Lizzy was saying, like there isn't that level of discernment yet, and I don't know that there ever will be either, within an AI to be able to create pull out the creativity, pull out the angle. I also think, Dustin, there's going to be something very valuable in terms of sharpening the narrative around brands that to a level that hasn't really been seen before. For example, like I really feel that, let's just say there's a ton of pet health supplements on the market.
Sure.
Right now, if you're super broad, you're saying you're one of the leading
Mm.
pet health supplement brands.
Mhm.
That is going to get pulled into an AI, and it's not going to be enough to serve you as a standout when someone searches for,
Yep.
pet health supplements with fish oil. So I
Yep.
think that like that level of granularity is going to have to get pulled in more and more to
Yeah.
boilerplates, messaging, to, all the things that help shape a brand, such that when you're reverse engineering kind of like what would someone prompt,
Mhm.
then you could actually tailor it so that you're answering those questions and offering synonyms and things so that it's easier to be found. So like that level of understanding of like, okay, AI needs this to give you Y, then
Yep.
if you don't have that in place, you're not going to be able to create the content it needs.
And I think you see that too, especially, I think you see that to a degree, like with local media and trade media already to a degree. And again, you would know better in the tech space than I would, but at least in the political space and government contracting, there's a lot of really niche language used because, you know, there's a lot of 8A companies or there's a lot of IT companies, but then you also have the what do they call them? There's customer service specialty companies inside IT. They don't do the tech, they do the management of the project. But then
Mhm.
you have the customer service experience people. So they really, in some industries, I think they're already getting into that for the bottom line. And I wonder how quickly some of those industries will translate that into what you're talking about for branding.
Well, I think that's again where we come in, right? Is being able
Right.
to go to the C-suite, exactly as you were saying, and say, hey, this is going to be important. We got to bring this in, if you want it to resonate.
I also
And
think a few years ago, everyone was really obsessed with buzzwords.
Mhm.
but not
Um,
BuzzFeed,
what? No,
not
buzzwords.
BuzzFeed.
No, buzzwords like boil the ocean and, unprecedented and game changing and
Oh,
things like that. I think that's out the window. I think
thank
really
God.
having a specific direct
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
messaging is going to be key. I think we're going to see companies totally dial it back and make it like absolutely so straightforward. This is what we do. This is who we do it for.
Mhm.
I think that's going to become more important than ever. I think a lot of like 2000 to 2015 was a lot of businesses trying to do a lot of different things, millions of things. I don't see that happening anymore. I think everyone's going to hone in not only on their messaging but on their product. It's a specific thing for a specific audience. I think niche will be more important than ever. I think specialty and specificity will be more important than ever.
Mhm.
Really be sort of an opposite playbook from what we saw like in 2015. I feel like was the rise of that.
At the same time, though, one of the things that I wonder sometimes is that those of us who are in the communication space, we phrases like what you just said, Lizzy, I tend to agree with it. but 97% of businesses are your local pizza shop, your local mechanic shop, your graphic designer who just has a website and their one person shop. When you're just talking about that, are you talking about more enterprise scale businesses, or do you think that was true even at that mom and pop level, the local business type of level?
No, I think at the enterprise level, everyone knows what a mom and pop pizza shop does, right?
Mhm.
Never tried to sugarcoat that. That's exactly what they do. I think franchises, brick and mortar companies, things like that, they've kind of been mastering this all along. I think enterprise will take a page out of that book.
You mean because they're more complex sales and now there's so many differentiations of it that they can dive into their specific pathway?
They just need to simplify, simplify, simplify. Really though,
Fair enough.
yeah, like a pizza shop sells pizza. What do you do as an
Yeah.
enterprise? Just
Yeah.
make it very simple, straightforward, easy to understand. That's
Something
that's
I feel like the enterprise has done for like the past couple decades is go what I call a mile wide and inch deep, right? So they're doing a lot of things, but they're not doing really any of them well. I think that's going
Yes.
to, I think it's going to be the exact opposite. I think we're going to look at like an inch wide, mile deep. Like I said, specificity, specialty. I think that's going to become more important than ever. Is being really, really good at what you do instead of being mediocre at doing everything.
Mhm.
Well, and messaging it that way. When I first started my company, and I know we're all talking about messaging anyway, but I want like when I first started my company, my business partner said, let's really narrow in on what we do best as a company. And I said, I heard someone say, I build businesses. And I was like, that's a great phrase. I said, oh, we help build businesses. And my partner and then a mentor at the time said, how many companies have you grown? I said, zero. Okay, Dustin. How many times have you gotten yourself in the press? I said, about 3,000. Use that number, Dustin. So we went back to using our phrase, we put you in the press, because that is that true inch wide and a mile deep. We don't do anything else. And you've
Right.
all gone even more narrow than that by saying we're in the industry or in the tech industry or high growth startups. And I think the best communications people I see on LinkedIn are the ones who have already mastered that. Because there
Mhm.
are agencies like mine, it took me years to figure out how to say what we do. Like we're a general earned media firm, but now we've gotten to be able to say we are earned media experts, not industry experts. And that's allowed us, I think, to break through some of that general component.
Yeah.
And so I do, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just think people are incredibly disenfranchised with industry jargon, right?
Yes,
They want to know what you do. People are also, I'm not going to use the word lazy. People are have very finite amount of time to figure
yes.
things out, right? And if
Mhm.
you're a service provider but you can't articulate the service that you
Oh
provide,
gosh.
you can bet that they're going to
Yes.
go to a different service provider. They don't want to take the
Mhm.
time to translate the jargon on your website, right?
Right,
There's also no need. There's so much industry competition, there's so much saturation that they can find a
right.
different partner in about 1.5 seconds, right? And so
Yeah.
your ability to articulate what you do best and how you do it and who you do it for will be key.
We're also dealing with attention spans that have been cut down to, you know, 0.0% of what they used to be. And
Yes.
so I
Mhm.
don't think there's that level of give and take that there was with a customer and a brand. There's no, as Liz was, no time. You gotta tell them right away what it is, what it does, do I want it, and make that decision in
Right.
the moment. And so I think the simpler, the more straightforward, the more concise too, you can break things down, it's really gonna make a difference.
Yeah. If you think about it in any other industry, we live in a completely on-demand economy, right?
Yeah.
Like you can get
Right.
something that you want within minutes in most facets of your life, right? Whether
Right.
that's a product, whether that's a service,
Mhm.
whether that's food. And this is no different, right? People aren't going to extend bandwidth to service providers and things like that just simply because they have it. They're not. They're looking for someone to be completely on demand with what they need. And if you're not, you're going to lose out on that bid.
Well, and you see it too at restaurants, right? The best restaurants, not only is their branding the best, if they're a pizza shop or whatever, but this I used to like the bigger menu when I was at 20 because I was eating 3,000 calories a day and eat whatever I want to. But
Yeah.
the older I got, I'm not a foodie in any sense of the imagination, but I began to appreciate a smaller, more narrower menu because that each piece of food is going to be higher quality. The way they cook it is going to be better. They're probably going to source better ingredients. So I think too, like one of the things that we talk about with some of our clients is make sure that you're not spreading yourself with your message because then it gives the impression that you're not only is your message so diffuse that you're not going to be able to get it through. But if you do, then there's the question of what's the high quality? Is your team diffuse? Are your processes diffuse? Can you actually provide the service that you claim? Um, Instead of, let's say you're a PR firm and you do digital, but you do it through a vendor versus having that, are you spreading yourself too thin with that in-house team?
Yeah.
Speaking of narrowness, one of the things we've talked about a few times today is the use of language and the specific use of language for LLMs or for general marketing, or spreading it out. You say one thing to this audience, one thing to that audience through a different channel. But where's the balance in trying to appeal to LLMs while also having that positive user language? There's a lot of people who say on LinkedIn, what was the phrase you said to me? Let's see this, I think first or second time we spoke. Was it I hate the algorithm on LinkedIn? I forget the exact.
Oh, I've probably said that 100 times.
Yeah, I think it was I'm so done with the algo, I think is what
Yeah.
you said. And this was a few months ago, just after they decided to kill the algorithm in December. And and there's a lot of people who try to live on the algorithm. They try to beat it.
Yeah.
And that they sacrifice so much of the user experience.
Right.
And so how do you plan to help your client see that yes, you have to be friends with the LLM, but you also have to have that positive user experience with your content? And Carly, go ahead.
I think it's the same thing as you would tell anyone. You want to be able to give a message that is going to be clear, concise, and just able to be synthesized quickly. That's real, like it's as simple as that. I don't think there needs to be more that goes into it beyond, breaking that down. It sounds a lot easier than it is, because when you are dealing with an enterprise, it's not so cut and dry. And so I think being able to hone that message, give them a clear vision. Sometimes the CEOs don't even know. Like they literally have no idea what they do when it comes down to it.
Sure.
And being able to help them iron out, like, what are you really offering at the end of the day? And it might not even be like the product or the feature or whatever. It's
Sure.
the, takeaway that a consumer or the business that they're selling to would want. And it's the same thing with an AI. It really is. It's just being able to say quickly, concisely, this is what I do and this is why I do it, and have the supporting proof points. I think that's one of the other things that we haven't really touched on, is that you do
Good
need to be
point.
able to have data. It's going to be way more important to have your own proprietary data, to be able to push out research on your own, to be able to push out content
Mhm.
on your own, to be able to push out things that are coming from you to signal that trust. And so, it's a whole trickle down effect of being able to have the message clear, but then also to have the supporting points to be able to show that everything I'm saying is true and valid and worth listening to. So I think that's also going to be part of it.
I think that I agree. I think being clear and concise and straight to the point and understanding your value add, I think those are key. I also think that ultimately it's not an either or, it's an and, right? You need to be creating content that's
Right.
going to be scrolled by the LLMs. There's really no way around it. That's going to be the future. You also need to be creating content that speaks to your target audience in a way that matters to them, in a way that lands with them.
Mhm.
A lot of times I talk to a lot of people on LinkedIn who have this issue of the content that they post that goes viral amongst an audience that's not going to pay for their services, right? So that would be the equivalent of like me going viral amongst PR people. Other PR people aren't going to hire me, right? And so there's a balance of creating that type of content that helps grow your following base, and then producing content that speaks directly to your clients, right? And their specific industries and their specific
Mhm.
pain points.
Right.
Businesses today, no matter what industry, need to become content production businesses, right?
Mhm.
That just has to be an arm of their company. You're seeing it across the board where these big corporations are hiring, the former editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal or Fortune. They're
Mhm.
hiring journalists to work in-house. And that's why, because content is king. It will be for the foreseeable future. The way that you produce content for your different audiences needs to be like an ongoing machine within your org. And it's not, you can't please everyone all the time, right? So you need to be able
And if you
to,
try to, you'll fail.
yeah, so you need to be able to create content for your specific audiences, for those specific mediums, uh,
Mhm.
on an ongoing basis. And you can't do it all at once. And so ultimately, I think that's going to be a big shift that we're going to see. Is you said, like, how can you do it all? And it's like, well, you do it all by doing it separately, over and over and over again.
That's again why I think the newsrooms are going to explode. I really do. I think there's going to be this just massive sway to brands putting out their own content and news and hiring those people to run it and really having that as kind of the tentpole mechanism for being able to disseminate just any information to the right people that they want to reach. And you could break it down into verticals, you could break it down into different newsletters,
Right.
things that people are doing now, but just coming from the brand's own publication, if you will, is going to be, I think, a really big deal.
Well, and I think you're exactly right. And the frustrating thing for me when I launched my firm was how so few companies under, say, $100 million really invest in their marketing and branding. Because I was raised by a small business entrepreneur who always had a robust marketing and branding program, I just assumed every company doing $1 million must have this massive marketing department. And then I thought, well, under 10 million.
Well, sure.
And at one point, I had a company, they're doing 100 million a year. They just hired their first VP of marketing. And I said, oh, we had several months of conversations. We were nurturing them. I was friends with the CEO. And eventually they said, well, we don't think we have enough content or enough going on within the company
Right.
to
Yeah, I
do
hear that a lot.
5 to 10K a month. And I was just like they had won a contract that each of the 5 years, so the 5-year contract was worth as much as they were currently generating in total revenue. And they never announced it.
Mhm.
And so that was a huge frustration for me. But I think it goes back to one of the core principles of marketing and branding is that 97% of companies don't invest in it enough or the right way. And so, and today with, as you said, the economy is only going to get busier. The digital economy is only going to get busier. If you don't do it right, you're just going to be so far behind the rest of your market.
Yeah.
I
The ones
think
that invest are going to be the ones that pull ahead of the pack for sure.
I also think that people care about knowing who's behind a business more than they ever have. They really care about who they're doing business with. I think 10 to
Mhm.
15 years ago, a logo was enough. It's not anymore. They really want to know who you are, what you stand for, what your values are, how you're going to run this company, what's your mission, who you
Mhm.
want to work with. I think that's key. And you said like that company that you were referencing was like, we don't have enough going on. And
Right.
I think that's so interesting. We hear it a lot too, Carly, where
Yes.
these companies come in and they're like, well, we don't have news. Especially today, you don't need news to make news, right? You
Mhm.
create news based on what you're doing. And I think people really love knowing the ins and the outs and the pulses of these businesses. It doesn't always have to be this flashy news story, right?
No,
They just
no,
want to know what's going on inside and what they can expect and sort of, if things were to happen, what the outcome would be, right? And I think, there was an era and still like on TikTok today, people live stream things. That's crazy. People are just watching people go about their day, doing things
right.
that everyone does on a daily basis. I think business is going to take a page out of that. And I think they're really going to start to kind of lower their walls and open their doors and start to show what's going on in the inner workings of that company. And that's really going to, I think, be a tremendous turning point for all these companies, right? Especially from a content perspective.
And just to bring it back around, I mean, I do think that the sooner brands start with that and building the foundational content and,
That's right.
putting that out is, I think there's going to be a leg up from the competition because there's going to be an award, so to speak, to whoever has the longest standing amount of content being produced on a singular topic. So if you wanted to be known as the company for, a founder that really cares about the environment. Like that needs to be shouted every day since the day one of putting content out. Because if another brand comes in, 5 years in and they're trying to overpower the search
Right.
engines and the LLMs with their messaging that they're the best, they're not going to be able to do it if this company has already gone to the lengths of being able to establish themselves. So I do think there's going to be priority with just longevity in terms of putting content out too. And so the sooner you start, the better you'll be.
You
But
can't
also,
backfill. You can't
You
backfill that.
can't backfill.
Right?
Yeah,
And it'll actually flag if you try.
that's exactly right.
really,
Creating
okay.
content. And so
Yeah.
you really like you cannot start as like there's no sooner time to start, right?
Mhm.
Like you have to start producing it now. You have to start producing it on a consistent and cadenced basis because there's really no way to make up for lost time.
Well, the other thing too is the a friend of mine started a health and wellness company in Rome, New York. You've probably never heard of Rome. It's 30, 40 minutes from either Rochester or Syracuse, I forget which. And they made the local paper. They didn't do anything special. They hired a nurse. But that to me is a really good example of your community and that you're building, wanting to know what you're doing. And if you're an enterprise scale company with 5,000 employees, sure, you can't trust everyone to have the brand on point. But the more people that you can have out there speaking their brand voice, we have a client that we're working with. They're putting together almost 20,000 teenagers coming for a 5-day conference this summer. And they brought us on to promote it. The biggest piece we've gotten for them ended up was at Fox News this past Sunday. It was Father's Day piece. It only referenced the event a couple of times in passing because this person, she's about the car accident. Her father saved her life and couldn't help her walk again and told her you have to rely on God. So the piece we targeted was around two fathers she's honoring, her earthly and heavenly father on Father's Day. That's a compelling narrative from someone we as the PR firm didn't know existed 6 weeks ago. This person is not formally affiliated with the organization, but her story was so compelling. We couldn't have known that if she didn't know somebody who knew the people we were working with at the national level. So when you're able to incorporate everyone involved in your organization, staff, vendors, customers, that's how you build that story. That's when the PR firm, was it you, Lizzy, you pointed out on one of your posts a few months back, what was it? The story that led the Wall Street Journal one particular weekend
Yeah.
wasn't some big, business story. It was like what people are drinking on Nantucket or something, right? Was this something really
Oh, I think this woman was like suing someone for $5 or something.
okay? And it was something really small. It was something like super tiny,
Niche
but
and
the
local.
human interest angle sold it.
So
And without that,
that's the key, right? Like we're no longer dealing with businesses and only businesses and only businesses.
right,
We're talking about
right.
humans here,
Yep.
human interest. People want to know where you stand. And the story that you referenced, you can't fake authenticity. You simply
You,
can't.
you
And people are going to
absolutely
be
cannot fake
looking
authenticity.
for those angles that resonate with them individually and personally
Yep.
moving forward in the media. They're not going to take any story for face value. They want to know how it impacts them.
Yep.
Every single story.
Yeah. Well, Lizzy, you were concerned we might not have a full hour of conversation, but you want to keep going past the hour? No, I'm kidding. I actually have to jump, unfortunately. I actually have to try to be on time for dinner tonight at 5:15. So I've got to jump. But this was a lot of fun. What is the one takeaway you want to leave with the audience about where PR is going over the next 5 years, or maybe where our clients should think about where PR is, where their brands are going over the next 5 years?
I think brands should stop thinking about PR how they've always thought about PR. I think they need to be open to the fact that this is a very evolving industry. They need to understand that it's going to change in ways that they're not familiar with, and they need to be open to learning about. And it'll continue to evolve, right? But your same old, the things that you've been doing for years are
Mhm.
not going to work as well as they always have. So be open to a pivot.
I would also add, again, the brands who start today are going to be the winners of tomorrow. So really take a hard look if you want to spend your ad budget on something that's just going to, last ephemerally, and you're going to see something that, you can't really capitalize on for other content purposes, turn into more of a flywheel. Really, earned media is that kind of wind beneath your wings when it comes to content that's going to make a difference and last and be there for the long haul. So to me, there's no better, investment than creating that sort of pinnacle to put all your eggs. So yeah.
And I'll just close by saying, to me, PR is it's either one of two things typically for a company. It's air cover if it doesn't have the support of marketing. But if it has the support of marketing, then it becomes one of many marketing and branding tools in the marketing and branding toolbox, and usually can improve the value of all the others. And not just because it lives forever, but because it does still have that logo. It does still have that usually more of a human interest angle that then you can spin off into any of those other channels. So Lizzy, Carly, this was so much fun. Thank you very much. Really appreciate
Thanks
your
for
time.
having me.